Let us read a familiar passage of Scripture found in Luke 16, beginning with the 19th verse. Luke 16, beginning with the 19th verse. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell, where there was torment, he looked up and saw Father Abraham with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to help me." Have Lazarus dip. I lost my place. Just a second. So he called Father. Do you ever do that? It happens. So he might as well admit it. You figured it out. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the cool water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in the fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you're in agony. And besides all of this, between us and you is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to there cannot, nor can anyone cross from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them that they will not come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if one goes from the dead to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And then in John 11:25, listen to these words. Jesus said unto her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, even though he dies, yet will he live." Now, this is one of the more interesting passages of Scripture, because Jesus gives us a parable that reminds us not only of the brevity of our life here and the uncertainty of certain things, like when the end of life comes. We know this. We spend a lifetime denying it, but the very fact of the matter is life has its temporal quality. The other thing that he tells us about it, though, is that there is a great divide at that point. There's a point at which life ends here, and everything that we are and have done is sealed. We can't change that at the moment of our death. We can't change that. We face God. We're accountable to Him for how we've lived our lives. In this parable, Jesus did what a good rabbi would do, a good teacher. He uses the furthest extremes possible in order to set the stage for this. He shows a rich man who is not only very wealthy, but is very self-absorbed in his wealth. Now, this is not a condemnation of wealth. That's not what it is at all. It's a condemnation of wealth that becomes the god of the person's life. Because you notice that the real key to understanding the rich man is he had no spirituality. There is no spiritual quality to this man's life. And I'll show you how we know that in just a minute. There is no spiritual quality to his life at all. All he is a man who lives for himself, lives for his luxury, lives for his own purposes. That's it. It's a very hedonistic type of life. On the other hand, you have Lazarus. Lazarus has absolutely nothing but his spirituality. There is within Lazarus' life some kind of a connection with God, some kind of a depth there, and I'll show you how we know that in just a minute. And the interesting thing is that they both are living in the same city, and really neither knows the other. Neither pays much attention to the other. Lazarus is trying to survive. The rich man is trying to squeeze everything out of life for his own pleasure that he possibly can. And Jesus says, I want to talk to you about these extremes of life. And the reason they picked the extremes is every one of us falls somewhere on the spectrum between this rich man, who is the most obscene example of wealth that you'll ever find, to this very, very poor man who is the most obscene vision of what poverty is about on this end. Everyone else falls in between that. And Jesus was saying, if you can understand my parable with these extremes, you can begin to find yourself where you need to be. Now, the way we know, when Lazarus and the rich man were living, evidently the rich man didn't even know Lazarus. But Jesus in the parable gives us the name Lazarus for the poor man. Notice that? Now, we have called the rich man Dives for years. That's only done by tradition. It is not anything Jesus gave us. So in essence, the way you have a relationship with someone is when somebody knows your name. God knew the name of the poor man. He didn't even know the rich man's name. That's the symbol that's here. Did God know who he was? Of course he did. But by naming the poor man, not naming the rich man, says, I have a relationship with this one spiritually. I don't have a relationship with this one spiritually. That's how we know. And it's pretty clear. Jesus uses all sorts of symbols like this throughout his teachings. Now, in that day and time, most of the ones who were struggling with the faith, most of the ones who were Christians, were people who were middle class or from the poorer side of the process. It's because they had greater needs and they were searching for some kind of a relationship, and it was easier for them to find this relationship with God. Those who were in the hierarchy of things, who had the possessions and the wealth and all, were so caught up in the religious structure of that day, they didn't think they needed anyone or anything else. And if you really pinned them down, they'd tell you they didn't need God either. That God needed them more than they needed God. God needed them to support the temple. God needed them to uphold the laws. God needed them to do the political things that they did. God needed them. But God wouldn't need somebody like Lazarus. But God knew Lazarus' name. Then we find the great equalizer, which was death. That single portal. Did it interest you at all that in the 3 deaths we've had, all 3 of those went through the same portal? Had you thought about that? An entertainer, a president, a tyrant, they all went through the same door. And every one of them will be accountable for the life they lived based upon the fact that they have entered there and can't change anything. And so what happens is, both of these men died according to Jesus' parable. Both of them went through the same portal, but what they found on the other side was quite different. Lazarus was taken by the angels, it says, to the very, in one translation, to the very bosom of Abraham, to go sit in Abraham's lap. There was no more wonderful place for a Jew than to go and be with Abraham and be sitting on his lap, just right there, embraced by Abraham. The rich man who had had everything he ever wanted found himself separated from everything. It talks about the flames of hell. It talks about that. I have no problem with that. But the more painful part of it was, he was in a place that nobody could get to him. He was thirsty. His lips were parched. And yet no one could bring him water. And you begin to see the real torment, the real hell of the situation for him. The flame of it was that I picture him sitting there saying, if I could just live my life again, I would do it this way. Don't you think? Don't you think that's fair to assume? And maybe the flames that he felt, and maybe this dissatisfaction that he felt, was as much in what he had not done as anything else. Look at the dialogue he has with Abraham. Father Abraham, what are you doing over there and me over here? Well, you chose that place, son. Well, Father Abraham, I'm thirsty here. Well, I'm terribly sorry, son. Well, ever the elitist cad, he looks and says, well, you got Lazarus over there. Send him out to get something for me. He said, son, it doesn't work that way here. You can't get to where I am. I can't get to where you are. There's a chasm there that cannot be breached. It's not going to happen. Well, if not that, at least go send him back to warn my brothers. You don't understand. We've been warning your brothers through the years. We warned you through Moses, the prophets. They wouldn't listen. Oh yeah, all that religious stuff. We don't listen to that. But if somebody came back from the dead, he said, look, Abraham said, look, if they won't listen to the truth that's proclaimed through Moses and the prophets, what makes you think they're going to listen to someone who comes back from the dead? And notice Jesus kind of tosses in a little extra there. He says, even if someone is resurrected from the dead. Foreshadowing what Jesus would do one day, and the fact that not everybody would even receive Him then. You see, the miracles really don't make the belief. The change of heart makes the belief. The miracle doesn't make things happen in a person's life. For him to change just because he was afraid would not have been a change at all. It would have been a reactive response to something that he didn't want to happen in his life. If I could live again, of course, if I could live again, I would do things differently. Don't you think that if the captain of the Titanic had another chance, he would have taken a different view toward icebergs? Don't you think that people, when the stock market, if we knew what we do now, don't you think they would have changed their balance of stocks and bonds and cash right before the stock market crash hit? Don't you think? Don't you think? Well, my dad used to say, when we moved to Conyers, he said, if I had known 25 years ago when I first moved here what I do when I retire, he said, I would have taken every penny I could scrape up from anywhere and bought land, because land was through the roof. What relationships would you change if you could live again? If you could go back and change something, what things would you try to prevent in your life if you could go do it again? What life decisions would you make? You see, if we had a chance to do it again, if we could be reactive in it, of course we're going to do right. If we're scared enough. But that's not a relationship. The irony is, and Jesus soberly told it, and He illustrated it, really the folly of the way that we use standards within life. He said the only thing that really matters is our relationship with God and really the relationship with each other. If I could live my life again, and the voice fades away from the rich man in the flames of hell, the voice fades away, and the flaming discontent of the rich man engulfs him for eternity, as he constantly says, if I had one more chance, if you could just send one more person, if somebody came back from the dead. Do you remember Lewis Carroll's poem? Just a few words from it. Ah, changeless through the changing scene, the ghostly whisperer rings between the dark refrain of what might have been. The race is o'er I might have run, the deeds are past I might have done, and sere the wreath I might have won. Sunk is the last faint flickering blaze, the vision of departed days. I vanished even as I gaze. The picture with their ruddy light and changed to dust and ashes white. And I am left alone with night. The aloneness, the emptiness that the man felt because of the decisions he'd made here. Lazarus was hungry, he wouldn't feed him. The rich man had plenty and tried to figure out ways to eat more. Lazarus was struggling, and the rich man never knew he was there. If he could live again, I'd invite him to the table. I would ask him to come and sit with me. I would fix his plate myself. Father Abraham, don't you know? Son, that's not the way it works. We don't get to live again to correct what we did wrong. We only make promises now for how we'll live from now until then, and then we'll have something worthy to offer there. There's a nifty story that is told in Moultrie, and I may have told some of you privately, but it's an interesting story about, there's a huge oak tree in Thomasville, Georgia. It's the icon of the city, the landmark of the city. Next to it lived this little man, and he loved Dwight Eisenhower, absolutely loved Eisenhower. Eisenhower would hunt in Thomasville, Georgia. And so what he would do is he would fly into Moultrie, into Spence Field, land his plane there, then go in motorcade from Moultrie to Thomasville, and in Thomasville go to one of the plantations and hunt, then go back to Moultrie and so forth. In Moultrie was a mayor, Willie B. Withers. He was mayor for years and years. He had his official car, and I could tell you a lot about Willie B., but I won't. But Willie B. Withers would meet the president and have a parade for him in town, and even have his picture done in flowers, all put together, camellias, because it's a camellia city there. He would have his portrait done in camellias and have it on the side. People would line the streets, and they'd cheer with their little American flags as Eisenhower would come through just to go on a hunting trip. Well, this man in Thomasville had always wanted to see Eisenhower. So one day he got up. He heard he was going to be landing in Moultrie. He got up and he went for the parade. And he got to Moultrie and he got a good place. And he stood there for a while. And he noticed nobody else was gathering. And finally he asked somebody, he said, "When is the parade?" And they said, "What parade?" And he said, "For Eisenhower." And he said, "Oh." Said, "You need to know," said, "he came early. He had his schedule change. He came early. It's all over." The man was so disappointed. He had a few errands to run. He ran them, went back home, went to his house right next to the big oak. And when he did, there was a note on the door. And he pulled the note off and he went in the house. And he went to sit down. And when he opened the note, it said, "I had come to town to hunt. And I wanted to see the big tree that everybody talks about, the big oak." And he said, "While I was there, I thought, well, I'll just see who this is that lives next door. I'm sorry I missed you." And it was signed Dwight Eisenhower. What might have been if he had just stayed put? If he hadn't been chasing off after something like that? What might have happened? And you see, most of our decisions that we make are blind decisions, really. The idea of getting up and going, it seems logical, doesn't it? But what about the most informed decisions? That's really what Christ calls us to do, to make informed decisions. Decisions that are based on His teachings, His example, the life that He lived, and what He set as the example for us. That's what He wants us to do. For us to go just in our own wisdom means that we will fail on many occasions. For us to go with the most informed decision possible, following the example of Christ, we will live a better life, a life that will hold a higher quality for us, and a life that will be filled with far less regrets. This doesn't mean that we can't have reasonable chances and challenges, but not if they compromise our bedrock principles. You just can't compromise your principles in what you know is true. The rich man should have had enough conscience to have taken care of Lazarus no matter what would happen later. There's going to be an ultimate meeting of our Maker. In everything that we do in life, we gather up things to present to Him as a life well lived or as a life poorly lived. And that's the problem with the story. So we come to the end of it, and we find that Dives, or whatever you want to call him, the rich man, is sitting there totally frustrated because he can't change anything anymore. Lazarus is in the lap of Abraham, experiencing all of the grace and the wonder that comes there. And those who are onlookers are beginning to say, well, what about me? How does this fit into my life? And the challenge is this. We're called to be a people of informed decisions. Psalm 19 tells us, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure, altogether righteous. They're more precious than gold, much more than gold. They're sweeter than honey from the comb. By them your servant is warned. In the keeping of them there is a great reward. Who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then I'll be blameless, innocent of great transgression. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. What would you do differently? How is life going to declare the quality of what you've done? Have you been interested in listening to the coverage of Gerald Ford? It's so sad that he didn't get to hear a lot of this before the man died. You know it. They're beginning to realize just how important some of his decisions were. And they're praising him for it after he's gone. Because death seals the things that we've done in life. But what matters to us, those of us who are living, is the promises that we make. When I was growing up, when some of you were growing up, the popular phrase was, today is the first day of the rest of your life. You remember that? On T-shirts, on posters, on signs, everywhere. Today is the first day of the rest of your life. Indeed it is. And the decisions and the promises that you and I make today are the decisions and promises that will affect the rest of our lives, yea, even beyond that into eternity. We can't live it again, but we can today decide to make a difference in the rest of the lives that we live. Thomas à Kempis, who lived from 1380 to 1471, he wrote The Imitation of Christ, wrote these words, reflecting on John 14:6, where Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He said, without the way there is no going. Without the truth there is no knowing. Without the life there is no living. Next week we begin looking at the way, the truth, and the life. And we begin to understand the going and the knowing. Many things in life. We're frustrated at times with just the pace of life, and at other times we're not real sure